Hello and welcome back. We are starting with module 4 today. In this module, we will be looking at the concept of speech communities. Now, speech community primarily refers to a group of people who share the language. However, the idea is rather nuanced and it has multiple layers of concepts and various types of controversies and disagreements and so on. And also speech community, the idea, the concept of speech community also encompasses a large number of related ideas. So, all of that we will be looking into within this module. So, these are some of the topics that we will be able to cover. Though speech community as a topic is rather vast, but we have tried to tell you a little bit, at least to give you a brief idea about most of the component features within the idea of speech community. So, today we will start with lecture 1. In lecture 1, we will first set the stage in terms of defining what is a speech community, how different scholars have defined it and what are the different perspectives on this same idea and how they changed over time. Gradually, we will come to where we are today. That is the first part, and second part of today's lecture we will talk about the idea of identity, language identity, and how that is part and parcel of the idea of speech community as well. This will be followed up by in lecture 2 with language attitude. This is another notion which is integral part of the idea of speech community, because the way you look at your own language also has a role to play, whether you consider yourself part of a community or not. So, of course, that is a much the idea is much more complex, but I am just giving you a brief idea. And then another idea within this is that the concept of ideology with respect to language. Then we have language socialization. So, these are the four broad domains. Within this we will try and incorporate as much data as possible, as much ideas as possible, and the last lecture we have kept specifically for discussing case studies. So, rather than discussing case studies for each of these ideas, of course, we will give some examples, but we will dedicate more amount of more time for case studies specifically in the last lecture. So, with that let us start with lecture 1. In lecture 1, as I said, we will focus on the definition of speech community, what is a speech community, and eventually we will get into the idea of identity with respect to again language. Now, before we start, let us clarify a few things. What is speech and what is community? Now, speech, when we say speech, it is not just a bunch of sounds that we put together, bunch of words that we put together to create a sentence. It is also not just the rules that pertain to the use of sounds, use of words, or the creation of sentences in a particular language. Those are of course important, but they are the structural aspect of it. But language and speech is its form, that is that you see, that you hear, but language at a deeper level is much more than its structure. It is also a what do you call it, is also a coming together of conceptualization, the way you look at the world, the way you conceptualize certain ideas and the belief systems and the properties of use, the rules of use, and so on and so forth. So, these are outside the domain of structure, these are in the domain of society, domain of cultural practices, and so on and so forth. So, any language has to follow a particular set of rules, particular way of looking at the world. So, that is something that we must keep in mind when we talk about speech and language. And then the second word in this is the word for community. Now, community is not again just a group of people, it is not a random group of people, but rather a group that shares values, notions, concepts, ideas, ideologies, and so on and so forth. So, this is the first thing to keep in mind when we discuss speech community. So, speech is not just the, of course, technically speaking, speech is the output, final output, language is the abstract notion, whatever is encoded in our mind, that is language, speech is the output. But even when we are communicating in a society, even when the output is the only thing that you see, we are still following the same patterns of usage, conceptualization and so on and so forth. So, these two things are crucial. Now, we go to the definition of what a speech community is. Now, this is not a very simple idea, as I said in the beginning, that this idea has been described, defined and countered by a number of scholars, both within sociolinguistics as well as within anthropological linguistics. So, we will have the definitions that I will discuss today are from both of these different, but related subdisciplines within linguistics. So, the term goes back all the way to, the use of the term goes back all the way to Bloomfield in 1933. This is how he defined a speech community, and I quote, "A group of people who use the same system of speech signals is a speech community." Primarily meaning the people, the group of people who use the same language can be called a speech community. Obviously, the value of language depends upon the people's using it in the same way. So, a speech community is a group of people who interact by means of speech. And from today's perspective, it was a rather simplified version of it. Similarly, there are others also, for example, Lyons also have said all people who are given a language or dialect is a speech community. So, this way of looking at speech community is primarily language driven. So, the focal point here is language. The language, people who identify with one language, all those people who speak the same language fall in the same category of speech community. So, as far as Bloomfield is concerned, this is 1933. So, that was pretty old. So, during that time, the prevalent idea of that time, language was, main focus of language was monolingual communities, monolingual people. So, it was a very simplistic, that is why it looks very simplistic in terms of definition. So, one group of people speak one language, English is spoken by the English, the British or the American, and then similarly French and so on and so forth. So, one group of people speaking one language is what is a speech community. So, the reason why this understanding is this way, it was because of the prevalent norms of the time 33. After that, of course, Chomsky comes into picture, and then a lot of ideas get redefined. Chomsky helps understanding the idea of community in a very different way and so on. We are not going into Chomsky because we are not getting into generativism, but after 45, after in the 50s and so on, things changed, the definition changed, and this was not very popular idea anymore. However, a little later in the 60s, 1960s, linguistic anthropologists brought back the discussion on the forefront, to the forefront of linguistic analysis. So, this is primarily from the anthropological perspective, linguistic anthropological perspective, and they have redefined the concept slightly away from the Bloomfieldian way of looking at it. Bloomfield's entire idea was based on the notion of only one language. So, language, whoever is sharing the language is part of the speech community. However, following their work, which work? Most importantly, the work by Gompers and Charles Ferguson, you might be aware of these two names. They had worked extensively on the variation within language. So, language variation we have already discussed before. Language variation, as in each language may have different varieties based on a number of factors. So, all of that understanding of language variation goes back to, and we owe it to the pioneering work by a few scholars, namely Gompers, Ferguson and then others as well. So, based on these studies, this was at that time it was understood that a community may have a colloquial and a classical version of the same language. So, language may have varieties on a number of parameters. One of the parameter could be the use of language, a version of the language as a colloquial variety and another as the standard variety or the official variety. This is the famous diglossia as was proposed by Ferguson in the around that time. Similarly, there were other scholars who were working on the similar lines. For example, one particular study in 1960s on the linguistic variation in Java. This also, so this kind of studies, not only Gumpers and Ferguson, but many other scholars were also interested in the variation, language variation. So, within one so called one language, you may have a number of varieties, number of variations. Now, this brought a different angle to the whole notion of speech community altogether. Now, as a direct result of all these findings, what happened was the very idea of language changed. It was not anymore a monolithic entity. Language was not considered to be one single entity without any subdivision. After following their work, now then it became a common knowledge, and over a period of time it became widely accepted and acknowledged as well that languages will have variations. Each language may have variations in terms of a number of factors. So, as a result of which this time 60s onwards, we saw a shift from language as a unitary system to a set of varieties with sufficient shared grammatical features. This is the most interesting part during that time. So, while languages do differ, it might have a standard versus non-standard variety, it may have many other variations. Lebov, for example, is another great scholar of that time who showed variation through various different perspectives and so on. So, the idea here was that one language may have multiple variations. However, they would generally share sufficient amount of grammatical features, grammatical, phonological and other features. Eventually, variety in terms of both structure and usage within the larger group were recognized. So, all of these were possible due to the number of work that the scholars of that time carried out on primarily focusing on the variations within a language, right. Therefore, speech community also got a refined definition after that. So, these are some definitions from that time. For example, by Gumpers, I will quote, any human aggregate characterized by regular and frequent interaction by means of a shared body of verbal signs and set off from similar aggregates by significant differences in language usage. That is how he defined in 1968. So, basically a group of people who are constantly in touch with and who constantly and frequently interact with each other on the basis of a shared verbal sign as in language and set off from similar aggregates. So, this is a speech community is not only understood in terms of the similarity, but also in terms of the dissimilarity. So, the one group within one group the members will behave in a particular way and they are different from yet another group who are also within the group, they also behave the same way, but these two groups behave differently, that is the idea. Similarly, Duranty refers to this. The new assumption was that during that time, for speakers to be able to acquire and use particular linguistic skills, they must be members of a community. So, what this means? This is very important. In order to use a language properly, which later on was called communicative competence, in order to use a language properly within the given society, one needs to be part of the community in order to understand those subtle cues about its proper usage, and hence it is an important notion. Similarly, Gumpers much later talks about regardless of the linguistic differences among them, the speech varieties employed within a speech community form a system because they are related to a shared set of social norms. So, here there is a serious departure from Bloomfieldian way of looking at speech community, because they identify that within a larger community depending on the variations there might be slight differences in the speech forms. However, they share a set of social norms. Hence, this is how language speech community came to be seen as after Gumpers, Ferguson and others work in this domain. Not only Gumpers, Ferguson and others, but there are many other scholars who also supported some directly, some indirectly the idea of they complemented actually of Gumpers notion on this on the speech community. For example, Delheim's description goes like this: fundamental concept for relation between language, speech and social structure. That is how he puts it. So, the connection between language, speech, that is why I defined language and speech in the very beginning. So, it is not only the spoken part of it, but also the underlying mental representation of language, both are connected to the social structure and together they are part of what is called speech community. And then he also highlighted the idea of boundaries in this case, because boundaries by the communities cannot be by definition fixed units. So, he introduced the idea of boundary as to how do you define a speech community, and because in terms of because humans are social beings and social groups cannot be cannot be within a fixed boundary. So, that is also a notion within speech community that was fronted by Delheim's notions. So, his model of what he called it ethnography of communication. So, his model of ethnography of communication and speaking underline the importance of communicative competence. So, that is what we started with. Communicative competence means how well you communicate within a particular social setup. You may know the grammar of a language, but you cannot have communicative competence unless and until you have passed the test of using it in a given social setting and using it appropriately for the given purpose. So, that is what communicative competence means. So, he further breaks it down, the knowledge a speaker must have to function as a member of a social group. Right. So, that is how he put it. So, communicative competence is the interrelationship of language with the other code of communicative conduct. That is how he defined it. Thus, he also supports the primary idea that speech community is a social rather than a merely linguistic entity. And then Leboeuf, another great scholar. So, his similar ideas were proposed by him as well. Now, his definition was based on his famous study on Lower East Side, New York. This was way back in 1966. So, his approach, his contribution to this debate was his approach shifted focus away from purely linguistic definitions and their limitations. So, in essence Leboeuf's idea about speech community is also in the same line as the other scholars before him, that the society and social norms are also equally important if not more. So, according to his definition, speech community is not defined by uniform language use, but by shared evaluative norms about language, and these norms are primarily social and cultural. So, speakers do not need to speak the same way, but must agree on the linguistic or language values. That is how Leboeuf puts it. Now, his study suggested that although different social classes pronounced variables differently, because we have seen that social when we discussed about variation, we saw that the class wise difference is also an important part within language variation. So, there might be different classes might have different ways of speaking. However, where do they converge? They all groups style shifted similarly. This is how he puts it, all groups style shifted similarly. What does he mean by that? More non-standard forms in informal context and more prestigious forms in formal self-conscious context. So, when the context is whether you are whichever class you belong to, whichever variety of the language that you generally speak, but all speakers need irrespective of the class, they are conscious about these two things, that the non-standard forms are to be used for informal context and the formal part, formal prestigious form should be used in the formal context. So, this shows This is what he meant by shared values or shared evaluation of prestige forms across classes. So, it is not only about prestige forms, the evaluation might be on the basis of many other factors as well, but this makes the point at least clear. There have been many criticism as well of Leboff's definition, mainly because sometimes some scholars have pointed out that he excluded the non-natives of New York, possibly hiding the origin of linguistic change. So, basically he focused on those groups that fit in the what is called the consensus model. So, lower classes share the upper class value. The value he talks about need not be the value that is shared by every group. That is what the other people say, that lower class always shares the upper class value. It need not be the case. One way of looking at it is the consensus model, which is what he probably followed. But then there is the other model which has been proposed by Milroy. So, that is called the conflict model. Conflict model talks about the divisions between unequal groups that typically exist in any social scenario. So, language ideologies maintain these divisions. So, sometimes these divisions are part of the signaling the identity marker and many other things. So, this is the other side of the story, the conflict model. And later scholars have some of them agree, some of them disagree. For example, Patrick disagrees with Milroy. He argues that Leboff acknowledged the pressure of standard norms as well and was not prescribing uniformity. Nonetheless, you get the idea that a number of scholars have talked about largely the same thing, because language structure might differ based on the variety one speaks, but the agreement is always on the social norms with respect to language structure and use. Now, in our times, Kachru has talked about speech community, and this is how he puts it. A great speech community crosses political boundaries, does not necessarily represent one religion or culture, comprises idiolects and dialects. It is much more detailed and nuanced definition. So, a speech community might be thought of as homogeneous, as a group of people linked by common social organization who talk to each other and who all speak alike. Now, this is an idealized situation, but does not always happen that way. Now, after seeing all these definitions, also let us understand what a speech community is not. Sometimes it is easy to understand something through a negative by cancelling out certain other possibilities. So, one of them has been provided by Wado. So, for example, he gives the example of English spoken at various places in the world, because we have already seen this before. English, due to colonialism, English is spoken all over the world, and like in India, Canada, South Africa and so on and so forth. So, they all speak English, but they do not constitute a speech community, because they speak in different ways and are socially and geographically isolated from one another. That is very important, because even though people in India and people in South Africa and Canada may all speak English, but we do not share the value system, we do not share the other norms of speech and so on and so forth. So, we do not fall in the same category of speech community. He emphasized that defining speech community on the basis of linguistic criteria leads to circular reasoning. So, as a result of which both linguistic and social criteria are to be used. So, not only from the times of Gumper, but even today we follow the same criteria, that we need social as well as linguistic criteria to define them. And yet another contribution comes from Saville Toik. So, this is essential criterion for community is that some significant dimension of experience has to be shared, that and for the speech community that the shared dimension be related to ways in which members of the group use, value and interpret language. So, not only the language has to be shared, but the experience has to be shared, and she also underlines which part, what does she mean that the experience has to be shared is that the way language is used, valued and interpreted. So, speech community requires shared dimension, that is the idea. In order to better describe her notions, she gives the idea of two types of communities, two types of speech communities, hard shelled and soft shelled, primarily looking at the boundaries. So, remember we talked about boundaries before. So, here also she also is talking about boundaries. So, some communities have a very strong boundary because they have minimal communication or interaction with outsiders, and norms of language and culture are strictly preserved. Those are the hard shelled communities. Soft shell communities will on the other hand have weak boundaries, as a result of which a lot of interaction with outsiders. So, the outgroup interaction with outgroup will be more strong, as a result of which the norms are less likely to be preserved. So, these are possibilities. Similarly, other scholars have talked about the same thing, that the stressed, for example, Morgan stressed that a truly anthropological understanding of speech community and its members' communicative competence need to go beyond the description of language use and include an analysis of how speakers value the different language varieties in their speech repertoire. Right. So, there are all these nuances that have been now brought into the definitional aspects of speech community. So, 2009 this was. Thus, the concept of speech community applies not only to those who speak the same language, it is now also established that language presents, embodies, constructs and constitutes meaningful participation in society and culture, and hence speech community assumes a shared, mutually intelligible symbolic and ideological communicative system, and at play among the members of the community. This is one of the latest definitions and explanations of the idea by Morgan in 2014. Now, there is another idea of the relationship among the members in the speech community. For example, Patrick talks about two kinds of relationship, one is nesting, the other is called overlapping. So, nesting versus overlapping. So, nesting is one speech community exists within another. For example, a New York youth gang is a speech community, it nests within the broader community of all New York gangs, which in turn nests within the city's speech community. So, when we talk about speech community and acknowledge that it has multiple different kinds of nuances within it with respect to the norms of the society and so on, we must also understand that there are different groups, different communities which are constantly interacting with each other. So, one way of that relationship among or between communities is the nesting pattern, where one speech community is part of a larger community which is part of even larger community and so on. Another is overlapping. So, different speech communities partially intersect. For example, in London, immigrant youths belong both to their ethnic origin group and to the wider pan-ethnic networks. We talked about this before when we talked about the dialect, the language variation with respect to networks in London. This is what the similar idea also was talked about by Patrick. So, the multicultural identities. So, that is primarily what the definitional aspect of speech community is. We have tried to give you a broad overview as to how definitions, how they started and where we are today. Now, within speech community, there are some ideas which are very important in defining, maintaining, constituting the idea of speech community. One of the most important is the idea of identity. Now, this how do we define identity? This is how it has been defined recently. The active negotiation of an individual's relationship with larger social constructs, in so far as this negotiation is signaled through language and other semiotic constructs, semiotic means. Identity then is neither attribute nor possession, but an individual and collective level process of semiosis, primarily something that you identify with. Now, the identity markers can be of various types, language is one of them. So, what is it that you identify with, what is your relationship with a particular group, what is it that you identify as, so on and so forth. So, identity basically literally means sameness, but its application is complex. It is difficult to decide on what basis people should be considered alike, since individuals vary in countless ways, and hence identity sometimes is imposed from the outside by the observers, but the more important idea of identity comes from within the individual as well as from within the group. So, how does an individual or a group own up their take ownership of their identity is more important rather than the one that is imposed on them by outsiders, by onlookers, or let us say from observers perspective. So, linguistic criteria to define speech community membership may differ from social, political, cultural, historical and political ones. So, this is linguistic way of identifying with a group is different from all of these other, because you can identify with multiple groups at the same time. Your linguistic identity might be just one of them, social group might be another of them, and it is not necessary that all of them should overlap. That is the idea. So, as I said that speakers' own understanding of their identity is important through ethnographic analysis of their pragmatic and metapragmatic action. So, group formation is driven by agency as to where do you want to belong. So, the person has to, or a group has to take ownership of it. Within this, an important idea is that of indexicality. This is quite a crucial notion within to discuss language and identity interrelationships. So, what does it talk about? It refers to the process by which language comes to be associated with specific locally or contextually significant social characteristics. So, how is it that what it stands for? So, or a whole language or a linguistic form can be an index of a speaker's social identity or of typical activities of that speaker. What does it mean? It is not always the language as a whole that you have to identify, that is your identity, but also the way you use or a particular form of language can also be used as an identity marker. For example, these days a lot of talk about Gen Z and all kinds of generations. So, there are those specific linguistic terms that they use in order to, so identity is a very very interesting concept. So, by which you not only create a positive identity, but also a negative identity, in the sense that by identifying with something using whatever method, social, cultural, linguistic, you have you define your identity, you belong to one group. At the same time, using those markers, you are also differentiating yourself from a neighboring group, let us say, from another possible identity or group identity. So, Gen Z or Gen Alpha or whatever you have. So, there are certain particular use of words, certain terms, certain words that they tend to use in order to mark themselves as different. So, that is important, not only to show that no, we are not part of the larger social group, we are separate. That kind of an idea is also very, very important. So, this is identity or typical activities of that particular speaker or a group of speakers. Therefore, language is associated with a sort of socially meaningful characteristic of the speaker. So, for example, speakers code switching, for example, is a particular behavior that may stand for certain kinds of social meaning. Sometimes a speaker's dialect may be judged unfavorably. So, the way one speaks may be taken as, it always is taken as, whether you are overtly showing it or not, the way somebody speaks is always judged. We always identify the person through his or her language and kind of categorize them as being part of group 1 or group 2 or 3 or whatever. One of them, one such study, for example, by Milroy again. So, speaker's dialect may be judged unfavorably or negatively sometimes. One case was that of Helen, whose voice was judged as aggressive and common. this was linked to the stereotypes of working class speakers. So, not only the language itself, not only the structure of the language, but also the way one speaks, the voice, the way your the speech quality is, the voice quality of voice is, that can also be used as a marker of your identity. So, identity, then what is identity? Identity is a social category. This is sociolinguistic researchers have historically assigned identity by social category membership, because it was found, and like class, gender, ethnicity and so on, it is founded on a correlational approach. Important study in 1974 defines social identity as that part of an individual's self concept which derives from his knowledge of his membership of a social group. So, this is how social identity through social grouping was proposed, and so this is a speaker's identity was viewed through language as a product of certain social factors. So, identity language as a marker of your social identity. So, primarily this kind of an identity marker is a social kind of a marking, the social category. So, being a member of one linguistic group, one speech community or one kind of identity that you assume, is all part of the larger social identity, and this goes back to a large extent the social identity theory by Turner and Thasfield 1979. The main idea within this this theory, this model was that a social category, any kind of social category, it can be your nationality, political affiliation, sports team or whichever into which one belongs or is part of, provides a definition of who one is. So, they distinguish between identities which are principally personal and identifies with which is principally associated with a group. So, identities can be various kinds, personal identity is one, group identity is another, but in both ways it is a social category. So, sometimes they could be principally personal and then group identity as well. So, SIT recognizes that we all identify with many personas at different times and places and in different contexts. So, we can be, for example, going back to the New York gang. So, it can be one gang, there are different gangs. So, one you can be member of gang number 1, part of the larger category of New York gangs and even larger category of New York city as such, all of that. So, that is always there, each of us are part of different social categories at any given point of time. However, we tend to simplify our identity marker, we tend to simplify away from a lot of this complexity. We do not always carry our different identities at the same time. So, depending how do we do that? Depending on context, we choose the most salient identity at any given point of time. What is most important at a particular given point of time? So, right at a particular moment, right at this moment, let us say I can identify as a teacher. I might have my ethnic identity, my linguistic identity as my cultural identity and so on and so forth, but given the current context I might want to identify only as a teacher. That is what he means. So, depending on what is salient in a given context is what we typically tend to stick to. So, when we consider a personal identity as salient, our behavior is more likely to be constrained by idiosyncratic aspects of our personality. So, why is it important that he proposed two kinds of identities, personal and group? Because when we identify, when we think the personal identity is salient, what we do is we are more constrained by the idiosyncratic properties of our identity marking mechanism. So, this predicts that when personal identity is at the basis of an interaction, then the subject will be more subject to more variability, including the way we talk. On the other hand, if in an interaction group identities are more salient, the way we behave and talk will tend to accentuate uniformity within the group. So, when you are part of a group, that is understood that when we are part of a group, you have to your linguistic behavior must conform to the set parameters. So, that is what he is talking about. So, social identity theory identifies two socio-cognitive processes, categorization and self enhancement. So, categorization, people along with self are assigned to contextually relevant social groups. This sharpens the intergroup boundaries and produced group distinctive norms, stereotypes and behaviors. On the other hand, self enhancement, in this case people often seek a positive self concept by favoring in group rather than out group through selective comparison that advantage the in group. So, these are the ideas that have been proposed. This is a very simplified way of putting it, but this makes this is the basic story about the SIT, the social identity theory. Then there is another important theory, similarly important theory, that of speech accommodation theory, proposed in 1977. So, what this does is this relies on the notion of social identity theory developed that we have just talked about, and this is based on the idea that speakers could change their speech while in conversation with others in order to get along or distance themselves from the interlocutors, because you have this social identity that you always carry. Now, depending on that, whatever you want, however you want to come across, you can either distance yourself or you can get along with the other people, other interlocutor, as in the people you are talking to. So, speakers either converge or diverge. In order to do that, they either converge or diverge. So, if you want to get along, you will converge on the speech style or the way the other person talks, or if you want to diverge, then you will choose the different kind of a speech form. That is the idea. So, convergence and divergence, adjusting one's speech to match or align. Divergence is adjusting one's speech to differentiate ourselves from the interlocutor. So, I want to keep my distinct identity intact. So, I would not converge on the speech form of the other person. So, this is how this idea is described. So, accommodation through speech can be regarded as an attempt on the part of a speaker to modify or disguise his persona in order to make it more acceptable to the person addressed. So, these are some of the nuances within the concept of social, within the concept of speech community, and within that the idea of identity and how we handle identity in speech situations. This is where we complete this lecture. Thank you.